So, Gautam, yeah, this is, I have read the book, I've reviewed the book, and now we are going to be talking about the book. Um, so, let's just dive right in. I won't ask you to sort of, kind of give us a summary of the book or the plot right away, although we will get to that at some point because the book has a very complex kind of a plot and structure and the backdrop in which the events happen. They are beautifully and very richly imagined, which you should actually read the book to find more about. But justice, rights, ethics, these are sort of three pillars that kind of hold up the book. But so, was your intention with the book to examine these concepts within a hypothetical society? Or was it to tell a story? And this just happened to be part of the story. So, which one was primary, you would say?
Yeah, I think with fiction, you always begin with telling a story, and for me, the way a novel begins is that I have one image in my head, and I know the ending. So that's how it begins.
Okay.
And for this novel, the image in my head was of a man frozen in time, and I knew how the story would end. And then the rest of it was weaving in, the details around that singular image, and of course. In doing that, science fiction is a genre that really lets you explore ideas, because in science fiction, what you can do is you can change one or two things about the world that you know, and then ask what if, and that what if then lets you shine a light back onto our world. So in this novel, of course, the what if or the change is that they have discovered technology that can preserve people in cryosleep for 100 years. And so instead of sentencing someone to death, you sentence them to what they call the sleep of death. And if it turns out that a mistake was made, if evidence comes out that shows they were innocent, then you can revive them. So you can reverse the death penalty, so to say. And so around that, obviously, then you spring up many ideas of justice, ethics, and rights, and then they come in through the story naturally. So I think that was the process. I think if you begin with the idea that you are using fiction as a vehicle to communicate ideas, then it's going to be a bad novel, I think. So
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. But very interestingly, where did this idea, this image of the man sort of frozen in cryosleep come from? Like, was it something you were watching, reading? I mean, or was it just?
Yeah, so cryopreservation is one of the oldest tropes in science fiction.
Of course.
It is normally used for long range space travel, where because, unless you have a hand wavy, science fantasy concept like hyperspace or wormholes or something as in Star Wars, space travel takes time. And so what science fiction normally does is it says, okay, the Voyagers are put in cryosleep. They will be woken up when they reach their destination. So it is one of the oldest tropes of science fiction. And of course, because of my day job, because of debates around the death penalty that I've been part of, participated in, intervened in, the idea came to me that what if this cryosleep was not used for long range space travel, but was used in the context of crime and punishment.
Of justice.
So that's how the idea came, and then it just took a life of its own from there.
Right. Okay. And so, like, I mean, this whole world is extremely richly imagined. I mean, this is one of those books which actually has a timeline. It doesn't have a map, but it has a timeline because, you need to know a little bit about. So, the place where it's set is called Peruma. It's a city state. And so there's events that have happened in Peruma's past, like in a much further in history, and then maybe 400-500 years before, and then 100 years before, till we arrive at the point where the action of the novel takes place. So all this kind of leads to a certain structure in which the city has grown. Would you like to tell us a little bit about and especially the guardians, what they signify, what their role is?
Yeah, so I think ever since Tolkien, we've all of us science fiction fantasy writers,
we look for a map.
Are drawn to a map and to a timeline, right? So like many thousands of years ago, it all began, and then things happened, and then more things happened, and now here we are. But this is not 3 ages. It's a shorter timeline. It's around 500 years.
It's still it's quite
it still is,
detailed,
yeah. So basically. the historical timeline spans 500 years. It begins with the fall of an empire, a continent-spanning empire, which then breaks up into 5 or 6 city-states that control, the city and the surrounding areas, which of course provides them with economic, sustenance. And Peruma, which used to be the capital of the empire, is basically divided, into a strict hierarchy where you have the aristocrats and the owners of capital and the merchants who occupy space, on one side of the Peruma of the river, on the north side, and over time, through a set of policies of gentrification, of evictions and so on, much like modern cities in many ways. Chandigarh when I was in Chandigarh, in fact, they told me that the book reminded them of Chandigarh. The fate was planned. I was doing an event over there. So they gradually begin to drive the workers beyond the river into a ghetto type situation. And this becomes worse and worse until 100 years before the events in the novel. There is widespread discontent. And then out of nowhere, the city's ruler is shot. She's shot dead, he's assassinated. And that sparks a revolution. And at the end of the revolution, the city is basically formally partitioned. And on the north side, you have the council and the aristocrats. The south side, you have the commune, which is now autonomous, the workers. And they managed to craft a charter that
Sort of a working relationship.
Yeah, a working relationship that says, okay, next 100 years we will not change anything and we'll just go on like we are to preserve peace and to stop violence. What also happens is that the person who is believed to have shot the director of the city, he is sentenced to the sleep of death, the cryogenic sleep. So 100 years, sleep of death is the sentence. And then we are now at the present day, the events of the novel, where 100 years are about to run out. So 2 things will happen. One is that since no evidence has come forward for the innocence of this man, he will be unplugged and he will die. And the second is that charter that the 2 parties had signed is now up for renegotiation, so starting afresh. And in this context, what these 2, the commune and the council, had done is that because they knew that they would have disputes, they created this class of neutral, you could think of them as lawyers, but highly stylized, lawyers called the guardians, who would represent their cases before a tribunal in case of a dispute. So that is going to happen now with respect to the renegotiation. But also what happens is that the protagonist, who is a guardian, is approached by a descendant of the man who was sentenced to the sleep of death. And she is told that there is an indication that he might be innocent. So you have to prove his innocence 100 years later and save his life, stop him from being unplugged and dying. And that's how the story then begins in present day.
Right. No, when you mentioned the hierarchical division of 2 areas, I mean, actually there are so many parallels. I mean, I am from a city called Jamshedpur, where that has exactly happened, right? Like the Tatas gentrified one area, and then the tribals were slowly pushed out of the city, and there was actually a river and they were actually pushed, and there is mining. So there's mining in this book also, which just strikes me that there are so many parallels. But what other sort of parallels in world history, Indian history, did you sort of think of when you were building this universe? And I mean, and I know several people in interviews and when they were reviewing the book, they've asked you if there are any parallels to current India, like, is there?
Yeah, I mean, look, current India, again, I mean, Tolkien said that I cordially dislike allegory in all its forms, right? And I think again, there's a point over there. And when you use fiction to, directly try and comment on politics and so on, again, it becomes didactic, it becomes a preaching kind of thing, and I think nobody enjoys being talked down to, right? So I think like that there are no direct parallels there. There are Easter eggs, there are little references that people from India will catch on to, which we can talk about in a bit. But that's more of an in joke between you and your readers, right? So yeah, okay, it's a shared context that you let the reader into a bit of a secret, right? So it's more establishing complicity between you and the reader. Historical events, yeah. So the major historical inspiration for the novel was the Paris Commune, which was a 3-month long experiment in 1871. When the workers of Paris successfully seized power and established a commune that was, after 3 months, militarily put down by the French army and with great violence and bloodshed. But for 3 months, they tried to experiment with non hierarchical forms of living. Legislators who are recallable and you can instruct them, other kinds of work functions, very democratic, women had a lot more rights. So, they tried to establish this experiment
This
of.
was pre-French Revolution.
No,
right?
this is post. This is yeah. In fact, the French Revolution was a historical memory for them. They were saying they were actually fulfilling the true promise of the French Revolution, and which was aborted by Napoleon. Right. So this was about 90 years after the French Revolution. Yeah. So it was 1871. 1871. Yeah. But the memory of the Paris Commune has always been, it's one of those iconic memories in left-wing intellectual history, in part because you never know what might have been, right? So there wasn't enough time for it to actually become authoritarian, or centralized. You don't know what would have happened. And after the Paris Commune, actually, in other places they tried to, they were inspired by that. So, for example, when the Chinese were fighting against their, oppressors during the Chinese Revolution in 1927. Again, for like roughly a month, there was a commune in Guangzhou, where again the Chinese army then comes in and it suppresses it. So there are these historical instances
the
where
Cultural Revolution itself took some ideas from the
well,
Paris
it did, and then it became completely authoritarian, right? So it became unrecognizable. So I mean, I guess like throughout history, there have been moments where you have these brief periods where workers and ordinary people actually take power and govern themselves in a true sense, but you never know what happens afterwards. And so part of this novel is, okay, let's imagine that it actually worked. They managed to hold on. What would they look like 100 years later? In trying to actually craft a kind of governance without hierarchies, which I explore a bit in the book. Yeah, so that's one of the historical inspirations. The other one is actually, again, this spans many countries, and this is more to do with law. But in Spain, they actually have something called Pacto Olvidado, which literally translates into the law of forgetting. And what the law of forgetting says is that when Spain had a dictatorship for 40 years, that General Franco, 1937 to 77, and when Franco died after 40 years, there was a transition to democracy. But the condition was that nobody can question what happened in that time, right? So if there was bloodshed, if there was repression, if people were disappeared, if they were executed, if they were jailed, you can't reopen that, right? So the price of democracy now is forget what happened. In Latin American countries, you have coups, military rule, and with great difficulty you manage to clamber out of that. But then again, you sign a pact, or the warring parties have this pact which says, okay, we will lay down our arms.
So kind of like a no man's land, but in time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you just like
space.
exactly, right. So like in Colombia, the FARC, right?
Yeah.
The FARC was when they were disbanded again. So you have all these pacts which say, okay, like we'll move ahead in peace, but don't question what happened in the past.
Right.
And one of the things the book explores is that sustainable? Or will that at some point really burst open? You can't suppress history in that way.
Exactly.
Right?
So I think what this tries to do is to basically say that, okay, like, nobody is going to ask for justice or retribution in this period. We will behave almost as if it didn't happen. And, after a certain amount of time has passed, then maybe, and the hope, I guess, is that tempers would have cooled and things would have seen in a better perspective. But is it even practical? Like, it just because you've gone into this,
I mean, the hope is that 3 generations down, you won't really care anymore, right? But that's obviously not how it works, right? And so, in fact,
can we, for instance, do it in Palestine?
Well, exactly, right. So Palestine is the example. In India, you have multiple examples, of Nelly in 1984, 2002. Like, you can just name all those examples, and obviously, people don't forget, right? And then generations don't forget. In Spain, in fact, they have this big dispute now about reopening, these graves of these people. There are disputes about street names, which were named after Franco's lieutenants. You never actually, you can't suppress the past, and societies cannot suppress the past, right? So it will come out in some way or the other. South Africa, where they have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the same thing. I mean, you think you've actually put the past to rest, but it comes up, in ways that are pathological. Then, it happens. Yeah.
Yeah. So, moving on to the bit about actually at the heart of the book, there's this really fascinating, like almost a murder mystery, because it's kind of a central core of the book around which. So Neela is actually the protagonist. She's investigating whether the guy who was supposed to have killed the director 100 years ago actually did it, because there is some fresh evidence which seems to indicate that he may not have, and he's actually been put to cryo sleep, in an unjust manner. So she has 7 days to unravel this and like get to the heart of whether he was wrongfully convicted or not. So she's also trying to solve that, and of course, as part of that, she has to solve, if not him, then who else could have done it, right? So I mean, what how did that sort of structure come to you? Why did you choose that structure, and how important actually is this element in the book?
Oh, in the sense of what it means for the
Yeah, I mean, how important was the whole murder mystery plot to the entire book? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, so the murder mystery is part of the book. It's not. I mean, the book itself isn't a murder mystery. It's not
right?
like a Japanese,
No,
like a
yeah,
Kigo
yeah,
Higashino novel where,
yeah,
like the whole thing is who did it and
yeah,
why,
yeah.
right? So, but I mean, the role that the murder here was playing is that, of course, it's not an ordinary murder, right? It's a political assassination, right? So it's an assassination of the city's ruler, the director. And not only that, it is an assassination that sparks a revolution. The historical inspiration actually was the assassination of Alexander II, the Tsar of Russia, who was actually killed in a similar manner to the killing in this
Which I had
book.
no idea about, but read up extensively
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So
for.
they first threw a bomb, and then they stabbed him. Somewhat similar in this book with the bomb, and then he shot. And that, of course, in Russia, it didn't immediately spark a revolution. It took 40 years more before it happened. But that was the inspiration. And here, of course, yeah. So I mean, when an assassination sparks a revolution which is successful, there's obviously a victorious party and a defeated party. The revolutionaries are victorious, and and in this case, it's an impasse, it's a stalemate. So then, what happens, of course, is that based on where you stand, that act has very different meaning for you, and therefore, the person doing it means something very different to you. So, if you are a revolutionary, then this is the act that gave birth to your revolution, and the man who did it is a martyr. He's a hero, and you worship him, and he is the reason why you exist. On the other hand, if you are from the northern part of town, if you are the aristocrat, if you are the businessman, if you are that person, then this is the act that caused the civil war. Because for you, it's a civil war. It's not a revolution. It's a civil war. It partitioned your city. It denied you control over labor, and therefore, the man who did it is an assassin, right? And he is to be despised, right? And so, therefore, if you are now saying 100 years later that actually he may not have done it, then it's not just about reopening a murder case. It is, were we living in the wrong history of the last 100 years? And do we now have to go back and redo history all over again? And wouldn't that completely destabilize, society? I mean, you can think of examples, right? Like if it now turned out that, say for example, and this is of course a common conspiracy theory, but if Gandhi wasn't killed by whom he was killed by somebody else, then you can imagine the upheaval then, right? So it's a bit like that, when you have these figures, and every society has figures who are larger than life, right? If it turns out that there was something off about them, then it can have a ripple effect that's spans out across time.
Or like Kennedy's murder, which
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
okay, the CIA orchestrated it, and
Yeah, I mean,
all
if you
of
were to
that.
say
And if you
have
can
proof of
actually
that,
prove
yeah,
it,
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it would change a lot of
Yeah.
things, I guess. Yeah. So, yeah. So, I was fascinated. I mean, there's so much to unpack in the book, and there's a lot of back reading you, and it's enjoyable in that sense to be able to figure out, okay, this concept, and very helpfully you've also given us some, like an appendix which has some information on further reading or whatever. But not that you can't enjoy the book without going into that, like. So, there's this concept you talk about called moral luck, which I found fascinating. I mean, I really hadn't come across it, and it's something from ethics. Would you like to explain? And in fact, I mean, can you think of a real world parallel for this to play out?
Well, I mean, real world, we can talk about that, but before that, so the idea of moral luck, it really goes back to these two different ideas about tragedy, the Greek idea and the Renaissance idea. And the Greek idea actually is not a real life example, but it's an example from famous Greek play Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the King, which I think many people here would know of. But in brief, Oedipus is prophesized, that he will murder his father and marry his mother, and therefore he's sent away, and things happen. I mean, I won't go into the details, but basically, when Oedipus is returning to Thebes, then at a crossroads, he meets a stranger. They get into a fight, and he ends up killing the stranger. And then when he goes back to Thebes, because of that, they make him the king, and then he marries the queen. It turns out that the stranger was his father, and the queen was his mother, right? And then of course, all hell breaks loose because what have you done? And the point of tragedy in the Oedipian sense was that you as an individual can do everything that is right step by step.
Right, yeah.
You need not intend to do harm or evil, but if you are just unlucky, right, it will then you could still
And there
end
are
up committing
circumstances beyond your
control, but you just get unlucky, right, and you end up doing something that is morally completely compromised. You see examples of this, and this is a big debate in criminal law, right? If I want to shoot someone, right, and I miss, right, I will still be punished for attempt to murder, but the punishment is less than murder, right? But actually, I just got lucky in the sense that I missed, right, in terms of the punishment. My intention was still to murder. It's just that I was a bad shot, or like the wind or the guy ducked or whatever, and that somehow reduces my culpability, which is very strange if you think about it, right? Like it shouldn't actually, because I am still the same, So, but clearly, therefore, moral luck in that way plays some role in our
Our overall
in the deep,
destinies.
So that was the Greek idea of tragedy, and then the Renaissance idea is that no, actually there has to be a fatal flaw within you. So Shakespeare, right? So all of Shakespeare's tragedies, Hamlet, King Lear, Othello, right? There is this fatal flaw: jealousy, indecision, cowardice. There's a fatal flaw, and that is what causes tragedy, right? So it's something wrong with you. And these have been the two conflicting ideas of tragedy that have been there. And so in 1979, in the Aristotelian Society Journal, there were two scholars, Bernard Williams and Tom Nagel, and they label this phenomenon moral luck.
Right.
So they had this debate saying, like, is it possible? Can you actually be morally unlucky, right? Like, does it even make sense to say I'm morally unlucky because of the can the consequences of my actions condition my moral sense, even though my intention was not to do wrong? And so one of the themes the book explores is that as an individual, I could do everything right, and still find myself in a place where nothing I do then is right. I'm doing wrong either way. So
Has this been explored in any other works of fiction? I mean, can you think of any works of fiction in which it has?
all of Greek tragedy is this. So Oedipus,
of
and
course. I
then
meant more
Antigone.
contemporary fiction. I mean,
Not offhand, but I'm sure it's there. Like I'm sure like it's there.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to think if, like, I'm sure there are. Yeah, like there are TV shows. I mean, something is okay. I can't remember exactly, but yeah, the whole concept of that, you may do everything every step of the way. You may do it morally and ethically and correctly, and then still sort of reach a harmful conclusion, right? Yeah. So that, and that. So okay, tell me something. I mean, you write prolifically. You edit a science fiction journal. You are a lawyer, of course. You write so much on the Constitution, commentate. Where you apparently also read a lot of classical literature and history. How the hell do you do this?
Uh, no, I mean, like many of these things are just like over time they sort of they accrue, right? So when I was doing my masters, I was fortunate enough to be in Oxford, and I had 1 year which was essentially basically free. So I ended up going to all
So
these.
instead of like playing Pokemon or whatever, you just sat and read Greek
Well, no, there were
tragedy.
all these wonderful
Makes
lectures
sense.
on the Aeneid. Just sit in them, and suddenly you see all these ideas of moral luck, and you're like, okay, this is a great science fiction idea, and then it stays in your head for 10 years, and it comes out in a novel like 10 years later. So I think it's just a accumulation of things over the years. It helps to actually have Lemony Snicket's books.
The series of
Yeah,
unfortunate
in
events.
that there
Yeah.
was the idea of a commonplace notebook, which
Uh-huh.
Claus has, where he notes down interesting things.
Right.
So I have one of those. I note down
Okay.
interesting things, and I just go back and look at it, and I'm like, oh, this is I can use this. So
Right,
that's how
yeah,
it
because
works.
it fits within the structure and the scope of this particular work, yeah. Which is the other thing that I really liked was the peacekeeper's dilemma, right? I mean, basically what we were discussing earlier, right? Like when you have to, this,
Yeah, I mean, so in this book, so the Star Trek series has this, this
yes,
Koyabashi Maru, right? Like this test which no one can really pass, and you have to do some innovative stuff to even, try and pass it. So there's the idea that you set up an impossible situation to test people. What will they do? So in this novel, to your final test as a guardian is something called the peacekeeper's dilemma, which again takes from all these Latin American countries where you had these treaties after the Civil War, saying that like, okay, the Civil War is over. Perhaps people did commit atrocities, they did kill civilians, they did cause murder, but there's now an amnesty, so we will not reopen any of that. And these have been challenged in courts, and sometimes they've been struck down, sometimes they've been upheld. So in this novel, the situation faced by a guardian taking the test is that there is a city where this has happened. So there's been a civil war. There's been lots of atrocities in the civil war. Now they have a treaty that is, that has brought about peace, and there is an amnesty. You cannot, prosecute anyone for their crimes, and this has been challenged in a court, and both sides have made it clear that if this agreement is to fall, they will restart fighting. Right? So, as the judge or as the tribunal, as the guardian, do you say, okay, like my job is to ensure justice, and the first rule of justice is that if you committed a crime, you have to face the law, right? You can't get away, and therefore I will strike down this treaty because it goes against that fundamental principle of justice, right? As in the US, they said 2 years ago, no justice, no peace, right? So in the Trayvon Martin incident, or do you say, as a judge, my job is to apply the law. Justice is what the law says is just. Here is the law. Law says amnesty. I apply it, right? So what do you do? I mean, and in the course of the book, different people give different answers, to that question. What would they do? And at the end of it, I mean, the idea is perhaps leave the reader with a thought. Okay, what would you do if you actually had the situation in real life? Would you say, okay, my
yeah, let go
fundamental,
of the the pain and the grievances,
yeah.
and we won't have to, we won't address them for now, but so that for
Yeah,
the
I mean, do
sake
you say,
of
okay, I'm bound. This
peace.
is the law says this. I have to implement it. I'm implementing it. Or do you say, okay, I mean, the law isn't enough. If the law is against something very fundamental in terms of justice, I will
And a
actually,
miscarriage of
yeah,
justice has
yeah,
happened.
yeah,
That I
yeah.
Yeah, because there may be this is from the a globe at the end of the book. It's There may be a time guardian when it doesn't matter whether our peace is founded on the truth or a lie. All that matters is that there is peace.
Yeah,
So
so
this is
one
a
line is this, and
fundamental idea,
and the other line is what Nila has on her pendant, which is
which is
"Let justice be done, though the world burn." Right. So one argument is that what matters most is justice. Doesn't matter, consequences don't matter. We must do justice even if the world burns. The other belief is that what matters is peace, and like let go of justice if you can have peace. Doesn't matter if it's based on falsehood, on lies, on violence, but like, so pick one,
justice
like, yeah,
should prevail
yeah,
first.
yeah.
So actually, the resolution of the peacekeeper's dilemma in the book comes towards the end, like, so which is an example to me of how, like, you might get the impression that it is a very erudite book, but you might get the impression that it's a very serious or a heavy book, but it's actually damn good fun to read, and it is very playful in many ways. So the resolution, I think, comes to Neela when she watches a play, right? And sort of it makes the how she can sort of resolve it clear to her. It's made clear to her through a play that she watches. So so like that, there's a very playful elements in the entire book. Was that sort of to offset the serious and heavy theme, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think in part yes, and also yeah, I mean, science fiction has always been a literature of ideas, right? And ideas can become heavy, and ideas can become oppressive, and just and in fact, there was a time in the '60s when writers of science fiction actually had the USP was that we are bad writers. But read us for the ideas, no, like forget the prose. Like it's. So I mean, Asimov, right? Like great ideas, not a good prose stylist, right? So Foundation is just not, a pleasurable read in that way. The ideas in Foundation are incredible. The prose is not, right? So
At the risk of being very heretical, I
yeah.
mean, I love Ursula Le Guin, but
Yeah.
like some of her.
Yeah, so her fantasy is fantastic. The Dispossessed as a prose novel is genuinely difficult at times because it's dense. But last 20 years, I think that's changed, and now actually the writing is equally important. You can't get away by saying, okay, I am an ideas person. So you have to actually tell a good story as well.
I'm
Yeah.
trying to ask you, right? Like, it cannot just be a vehicle for
Yeah.
ideas.
Yeah.
The story has to be
Yeah.
a good.
Yeah, and in the story, people break down, people have their moments of levity, people have banter, people joke, people play practical jokes, and yeah, in this book you have all of that. So yeah,
So
yeah.
it's a very very playful and fun book actually, like to read, which and so another thing that really brings that out is the fact that you've used a lot of dialogue in the book as well. So a lot of exposition is not like info dump, ki, like just long pages of, but it happens through dialogue. So yeah, so a lot of the plot line, the moving ahead, and how Neela's thinking she's got this friend called Maru with whom she's was that, by the way, was he named Maru, named after Kobayashi Maru?
No. There is a death penalty case called Maru Ram versus Union of India. So,
Oh my God! How many
many of
Easter eggs
many of the
got there?
names are actually death penalty cases from India. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, we should talk a little bit more about that then. Because when I read about the Kobayashi Maru connection, I was like, okay, did he name the character after that? So yeah, so no, so there's a lot of dialogue in the book because that. So was that also something that, do you find it easy or hard to write dialogue?
Writing dialogue is really hard for me because of my day job as a lawyer, where you draft, right? And when you're drafting, it's always the written voice. It's meant to be clean, austere, precise, direct. Human dialogue is none of that, right? It never is.
Yeah.
And so moving, mentally shifting gears from legal drafting to dialogue is really hard. And I'm actually very grateful for all the beta readers, the editors who really help me with that because it's very
So what
difficult.
helps break that down? Like, so how do you make that switch?
Reading it out to yourself. So
Okay.
one of the standard things people always say is that if you're struggling with with any writing, but fiction writing, but with dialogue specifically, read it out to yourself, look
Right.
into a mirror, read it out, and if it is sounding off, you'll know.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so you made an attempt to make it sound like real people talking, like
Well,
people.
well, again, it's a little complex because again, like in no novel will you find people talking exactly like real people talk, right? So
Yeah,
that'll
true.
be boring also, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
most of human interactions are boring in that sense, right? So there has to be some stylization, obviously,
Right.
but yeah, I mean something closer to the rhythms of conversation
Right.
than you would
Yeah,
otherwise
and
have.
no,
Yeah.
that actually comes across, and the good thing is that you don't do like the he says, she says, he says, she says. So okay, you have to read a little intelligently, but it's very easy to make out like who's saying what.
Yeah.
It's dialogue, so it's like back and forth. But it actually makes it easier to read rather than if you were doing
Yeah.
Maru said and Neela said and whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, one thing people say is that don't use all these synonyms for said. Like, don't go like
Huh.
growled and like
Oh my
all that.
God.
So just say said. That's
That is as a journalist like something I've learned over the years, because we are also tempted to say like he or she guffawed. Like you
yeah.
can't really guffaw and talk.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah.
Snarled or like growled and
Huh, huh,
yeah.
huh. So what are some of the other Easter eggs? I'm very curious now. So like which other cases have you referenced for which are some of the Easter eggs for, say, your lawyer friends,
Yeah. Okay.
and
Yeah.
which are
Yeah.
some for sci-fi readers?
So there is a snarky aside towards PILs, public interest litigation. That people keep trying to solve political problems using PILs.
Right.
So that's something lawyers will immediately recognize. There is a point in the novel where they pull up the record of the previous 7 people who have
I
been
love that bit. There's so much
resurrected.
detail in
Yeah,
that.
yeah. So they've been the previous 7 people who were resurrected after having been proven innocent. So all those names are actual death penalty cases in Indian history. Yeah,
Really?
yeah, they're all death penalty, like people who
Wow.
were sentenced to death. And then there is a reference to the coalition against the death penalty, which is an actual. There is an institution. I won't name them, but they do death penalty work in Delhi. So there is a reference to them. So yeah, so there is there are lots of lawyer Easter eggs which lawyers will find perhaps funny, and otherwise, I mean, I think beyond that, for Indian readers who are not lawyers, there is a reference to Urumi, which is a sword fighting form in Kerala. A reference to that, and a few others that are Indian specific.
Because Gautam here is also a fencer. He's like he's all about the
Yeah,
joust and parry.
I can't resist putting a fencing scene in every novel I write. So yeah.
Yeah. And for the sci-fi readers, what were the Easter eggs?
Well, so the main one obviously is cryogenic sleep, right? So
Right,
that's
yeah.
an old science fiction tradition.
Right.
And then there is Koyabashi Maru, like the
Yes.
Star Trek's impossible test, or the test of impossibility. That's pretty much it. I mean, otherwise they're just like, I mean, every genre has conventions and rules, and the book follows many of those,
Yeah.
in those terms.
I was just trying to find that list of like the 7 cases which kind of are
Yeah.
they go through, and it seemed like to me, I mean, each of them could be like a short story at least.
Yeah.
So like really dense. Okay, I think we can do audience questions now. I mean,
Yeah, so this passage is from early on in the book, when so Nila, the protagonist, is just starting her work on the case, and she finds that there was a time in the city's history when the death penalty was abolished, and then 25 years later, the science of cryogenic preservation was discovered, and then they reinstated the death penalty because now it could be reversed. So they reinstated that. Then that led to a legal case where the court then upheld that, and then there was a judge who dissented, and that dissent sort of like brought out some of the moral issues in that. So she just like reads that dissent, and I'll read that part out, and it sort of sums up, I think, some of the perhaps ideas in the book. Yeah, okay. This is around part 2 of the book, the second day of her work.
this is Khana.
Yeah, it's Khana. Yeah. So again, lawyers will know the reference there. Well, the famous ADM Jabalpur case where there was a dissenting judgment. Yeah, Indira Gandhi's emergency. Yeah. Okay. 25 years ago, the Directorate Court abolished the death penalty. Our decision was celebrated not only in this city, but across the subcontinent. What Peruma thinks today, the subcontinent thinks tomorrow. In our wake, city after city removed this vestige of barbarism from their own laws. Today, this court has decided to consign its own legacy to a sleep of death. In a way, it was a chronicle foretold. This court's ruling from 25 years ago was based on a single premise, that death penalty assumes infallibility of knowledge, of truth, of judgment. We are human. We make mistakes. Yet, the death penalty does not allow us to atone for error, because you cannot bring an innocent person back to life. Writing separately, the wise Judge Ilarum warned against this reasoning. The claim to infallibility was just one of the many reasons why death penalty had to go. But to base judgment only upon that was to build a castle upon a foundation of smoke. Perhaps Judge Ilarum saw the future. In her time, there was no indication that cryogenic preservation research would advance so far, that within 25 years, it would go from a futuristic dream to a workable technology. And unfortunately, it has also given this court a chance to resile from its historic decision. Today's court appears to argue thus: cryogenic preservation has turned death penalty from an irreversible punishment to a reversible one. This has dissolved the only distinction that existed between death penalty and any other form of punishment. We can at last atone for human error. If we find out that we made a mistake, we can just wake the sleeper up. Let me take this argument on its own terms. There may have been a case to answer had the sleep of death, ironically, itself been permanent. But it is not. Our science only allows for preservation up to 100 years. After that, the body breaks down. Death must come. The court attempts to escape this bind by seeking refuge in mathematics. It takes the mathematical concept of the limit. X can approach y such that x is never equal to y, but the difference between them grows so vanishingly small that for certain purposes, you might as well take x to be y. Then the court says that while the possibility of an error can never be zero, with time it grows smaller and smaller towards zero. And when 100 years have passed, for all practical purposes, the probability of error has become zero. The court uses these fictions to exempt itself from the burden of infallibility. But life is not quite as symmetrical and elegant as mathematics. When the court says that the probability of error approaches zero with time, it performs a sleight of hand. What it is really saying is that the probability of discovering error approaches zero. Evidence erodes, witnesses die, memories senesce. The fault is not with the truth, it is with our ability to discover it, flawed from the first to the last. That's why I believe that this new technology solves nothing. By allowing this so-called sleep of death, the court readmits brutality into our justice system, only this time cloaked in the language of reversibility. And what reversibility? Let me part with this thought. Imagine that in the 99th year of a sentence, irrefutable evidence of innocence comes out. You awaken the sleeper into an alien world. Their parents, lovers, friends, children, all dead for generations. Every anchor to their world gone. But memories remain. The half-life they have lived remains. They cannot escape from that. They cannot start over. They will live as ghosts, a part of their lives in one century and a part in another. Two broken halves. And this is not reversible. What do you expect will happen then to the half-life that remains, other than decay? If we denied ourselves the right to kill in the name of justice, what right do we have to snap and weld and solder broken bits of life in the name of justice? I have attempted to persuade my colleagues to this point of view. I have failed. With due deference to the tradition of consensus at the court, I exercise my prerogative to dissent. I believe that today we have once again arrogated to ourselves the crown of infallibility that we had set aside 25 years ago. It is a burden that will one day haunt us. So that is the passage, and then, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm probably I was going to say, I was seeing Easter eggs everywhere. So was towards zero a reference to Agatha Christie's
Yeah,
towards
yeah,
zero?
yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, correct.
Thank
Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
Okay. Questions from the audience?
Okay, no, we were just talking that Thomas Hardy is one writer who does a lot of moral, the flaws and as well as the. Okay, one question which I wanted to ask you, which was super fascinating when we read it, is that you spent a lot of time in even urban planning the commune.
Yeah.
So can you just talk a little bit about your inspirations and how you did that?
Yeah, I mean, so in Paris there is a little place called Ivry-sur-Seine, which is south of Paris, where in the 1970s there was a communist mayor, still is actually, and they tried to put in place this radical architecture. And it's, I mean, if you just look up that online, and and so they had these really incredible buildings where they tried to implement that kind of thing, where you sort of blur the in and the out. You try and combat the atomism of modern life by having these like galleries that go around, and then you step out of that. Indoors, outdoors are a little blurred, like the public private is a little blurred. So they did all that, and it was really interesting. And there is a book called Building Without Authority, which explores various attempts of this kind. So how anarchists have imagined urban planning and architecture, where again, I mean, the idea is that modern life basically tries to shut us all up into our individual like lives, right? So Auden's poem, each in the cell of himself. So how do you use architecture to plan that? It also, interestingly, since you asked this question, just this week at the World Book Fair, I picked up this in Delhi. I picked up this book on Italian radical history in the 1950s or 60s. It was called Operaismo. Opera means worker in Italian, and they had a lot of stuff actually about just the way that architecture affects politics and just social life, right? So is your architecture hierarchical? Is your architecture going to close off spaces? Will it open up spaces? Yeah. So it's a whole study. It's a whole field, and I found it very interesting. And so the Commune's urban design was inspired in part by Ivry in Paris, but also all of this. So there are these various terms, phalansteries and arcologies, which people have used to try and have these open plan spaces. Again, blur the in and the out. Yeah. So all of that played a part in designing the Commune. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, even I had that thought, and I had another thought, Gautam. If you're not careful, you'll be taken for Gautam Bhatia, the architect, next. So there is
Yeah,
an
actually,
that is a very well
yeah.
thought.
So in Bahari San's Chandigarh, where my book event was, in the photo they actually put one of his books as well.
Of
So,
course,
yeah,
of
yeah,
course.
So,
See, you please don't talk anymore about architecture because next they'll think you're him. Okay, any other questions?
So the main character is somebody who we see the world through. But also I found it interesting that we also see her internal journey. And it's interesting that you choose a woman to explore this world and to explore herself. And many of the dilemmas we face, she faces in her life. I just wanted to know what is the work you had to do to take this woman's POV?
yeah. So this is something that requires very, very how do I say this? Uncompromising readers who will give you frank feedback on where you're going wrong with occupying a different POV, right? So that's basically it. So they will tell you that, look, this is reading very male coded, and this is why. So change this, and so then you change it, and then it goes through multiple iterations until finally it's something that hopefully passes passes muster. Yeah, I mean, so I think the thing is that obviously part of writing is to inhabit a point of view that is not your own. That is part of the point. And specifically with respect to science fiction and fantasy, it is also about historically it's been a very, very male coded genre in points of view. And in fact, Rick Riordan was asked this question 10 years ago or so. Why are so many of your characters non-male in different ways? And he said that actually that is the normal, right? Your book should reflect the diversity of the world, right? So it's just correcting for your historic narrowness now. So it's the idea is that, and the process of course is making sure that those who do inhabit the point of view they read what you're writing and then give you completely honest feedback saying that this is why this is not working, this is what you need to think about, and all of that. So that's basically how it's done. It's always a challenge and you always fall short, but I think that's part of the thing. Yeah. Although again, I mean, I think it's not so much I think a conscious choice as well. It's more like it just felt the story demanded. Yeah. I mean, it was that, and then of course all the other things follow from that.
Yeah. Hello, sir. I have a question. So the book is discussing about the justice and truth, sir.
Yeah.
So when we go to jurisprudence of it, sir, what do you think is more important, justice or truth?
Well, that is the debate in the book. Yeah.
So you told that justice is primary purpose of every court and also. But don't you think if there is no truth and justice, it will be what I can say a quoted lie, sir? If there's no truth and justice.
Yeah, so I mean, part of what the book explores is that different people have different truths, and specifically when it becomes, a dispute in court. So there's never, it's always hard to say, okay, this is the one truth that we're going to go with, and it's a question of a battle between different people hold on as their truth, and then what does justice do in that sense is what the book explores. I don't have a strong view personally on it, so it's more and especially in fiction, you try not to feed your views. It's more like raise the question, which is in the book, the question is that if you're faced with a possible conflict between what is just and what is true, then which one do you pick? And what the answer is not, that's something readers will decide when they read the book and, see how it unfolds.
Yeah, that's like spoilers.
Yeah, that's a spoiler. Yeah, that's the ending basically. So it's a spoiler. Yeah, yeah.
So this conversation kind of reminded me of Westworld, and the last season there was something about how AI can make out if somebody has committed some crime. So, being a science fiction writer and also being from a legal background, do you see something like this happening? Increasing use of AI in jurisprudence?
I mean, so Philip K. Dick has multiple novels where he has these people called precogs who can actually like foresee, when somebody will commit a crime, and then they're used to, Minority Report, of course, So, but the origin was Philip K. Dick's novels in the 50s. I think we're far away from that, obviously. But what we are already seeing is that AI is being used to profile people based on their past conduct. And to then surveil them, because the idea is that if in the past you have committed crimes, then you are likely to do it in the future. And therefore, so in Chennai, for example, they have this surveillance thing called face tagger, and what happens is that if you're on a police database already, then the face tagger app, which also has access to that, will then pick like your face, and then they will surveil you in that way. So in that way, already you're using AI in all kinds of very deleterious ways to, already oppress people who are already, vulnerable, and that's happening right now. So it's not a science fiction thing anymore. It's our reality right now. Yeah.
But I mean, I think is there, like, judges are human beings, right? So do you think if we, who have their own emotions and their own baggage and come with their own experiences, which may color their judgment, do you think that having an AI do it, which doesn't presumably have emotions or
Absolutely
life
not.
experience?
No, because you have to train the AI on human data, right? So
course.
it's never going to be neutral in that way.
It's never going to be neutral. True.
Hi, did you ever consider Neela, the protagonist, to be like from the other part of town, or because I wonder if the book would have been as rich in its moral dilemmas in discovering the commune and its architecture if she were.
No,
from
she was
there.
always going to be a communard. That was always. I mean, that was always clear to me. So
Was there where you started off from? Like this is part of the book?
Yeah. I mean, so in the beginning, her identity as a commune person was not that strong in the first draft, but then I could see there was a lot of potential for bringing out all this, tension with her mother and all of that. So it became stronger over time, but she was always going to be from there. That was always fixed from the beginning. That didn't change. Of course, her companion Maru is from the other side, so that gives you the other side's perspective a little bit. But no, she was always going to be from the commune. That was always there.
If I may ask a
Yeah.
follow-up question, is just how do you build a world when you're writing a science fiction novel? Because it's very much like mathematics in its essence, like there are axioms and you build that world from there. So for this book, how did you start out? Like what was your first draft? What things were set in stone?
So there's normally, so schematically you have two ways that people say you can go, gardeners and architects, or plotters and pansters, pansters being seat of your pants, flying by seat of your pants. So architects are those who, lay the foundations, do everything, have the structure in place, and then they start building. Gardeners like go around the garden, like dropping the seeds and seeing where it lands and all of that. So I've always been a gardener, right? So like I said, I begin with an image in my head and the ending. I know the ending, I know the image, and then the world is built around that. What it normally means is my first draft is absolutely horrendous, and it's really bad. It's sort of written just off the cuff, and then the real work begins with the second draft, and and that's where the world begins to be built. In this book, I sort of knew that there would be a partition city, and then for the upper half, I was taking inspiration from various anime cities, like high towers, skyscrapers, all of that. So your Japanese anime, like the way they have their those cities, and the commune, of course. I've spoken of the inspiration there, and with each draft it becomes more complex and you think of more things. So for example, chapter 3, which is the island they go to, that didn't exist in the that only came in the final draft, right? So until the very end, for me, I'm still building the world until the final draft. It's maybe not the best way because you're really it's very chaotic. But that's work. It works for me. Yeah. So for me, it's like until the last draft, the world is still sort of like coming into shape. Yeah, that's how I do it.
Gautam, just two questions. First is on the remark that you made as to how do you sort of write the book. You said it's the image, and you sort of have an idea of the ending, and then you construct on it. Stepping back and reflecting, the image that emerges, and also the ending, the whole scheme, that just happens to you, right? Is it also because of the churning that happens around many issues that you actually bring up, right? Because you said, look, you can't write a book around specific ideas, but what you do is the image. But when you step back, how did this image come? That must be, is it through some conscious or subconscious churn that happens within over a period of time, including those little ideas that you would have picked up in your book and so on? Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I mean,
It's my
so,
first
so
question.
actually,
I have a follow-up.
Yeah, there's a really good book called the Op-Ed Novel, which traces the way that in post-Franco Spain, the major writers, Javier Marais and all of them, were actually also regular op-ed columnists in El País, in El Mundo, all of those newspapers. And what they did was that, so if there was an idea that was too radical or too out there to advance in non-fiction in the op-ed, they would test it first in novel form and vice versa. So they basically used the two forms. Of course, they were faithful to the respective forms, but there was this very interesting overlap, where the same set of ideas they would pursue both in the op-ed pages and in their fiction. So in that sense, yeah, I mean, of course, the image itself of a man frozen in time and using that for punishment is obviously informed by my engagement with capital punishment in India, right? So that's inevitable. It has to happen. And then, of course, once you begin writing, you can't shut off that world, right? So obviously, those debates will inform the novel. I think the key is to ensure that they don't take over the novel, because then it'll be a bad novel, right? Like it's that simple. It won't be a good story if you're trying to push an idea. The idea has to come through the story.
The second one is, let me stay with the term truth, justice, and peace. And you made a remark saying burying truth, and saying, look, let's move forward in the interest of peace is not sustainable. Did I understand right?
Well, it's been shown to be non-sustainable in many countries. Yeah.
Right. So, if you move further, then say the truth and peace can coexist if a society is evolved enough to say this is the truth, contrary to what we thought earlier, but in the interest of peace and justice, it needed to be treated differently and not with reprisal, right? Comments on that?
But it's possible in theory. I mean, I don't know if it happens really. So
yeah. Agreed. Yeah. But the point is, isn't human advancement is towards that aspiration?
Right? I mean, I am not really very convinced of human advancement. Like seeing what's happening around us. I don't think we're advancing anywhere. Like we may be stuck, but we're not like evolving to better people.
Yeah, maybe in a very scientifically, in a very, very rational society. But unfortunately, I think we are very far from a...
Yeah. No, yeah. No, I think it's more realistic than pessimistic. Yeah. I mean, I'd love it to be true, but yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I think a little bit continuation of that. I mean, I'm not a reader of science fiction, but I saw the three words, justice and rights and ethics, and that's how I came here. And I'm interested in these things. So going a little bit off the plot and science fiction and stuff like that. So justice is something which is a what do you call that, creation of humankind. It is, justice is not there in nature. It's not there in, with animals and things like that. Yeah. So we're supposed to be slightly superior and bring justice to the world, that you do just, somebody is sick and then you are still trying to not let him die and stuff like that. But if you look at the reality, and if you compare justice and equality, the inequality is also far more larger in the human world as compared to, let us say, animal world or plants world or something like that. So are we really in the right path to justice? That's my question.
I think that's the question that would require, I think, many days to really like flesh out. I don't know. In some ways, yes, in some ways, no, I guess. But yeah.
I actually had two questions,
Yes.
if that's okay. Since you mentioned Snicket, and since we're talking about science fiction and constitution and rights and laws, I know foreshadowing is a big thing when you write fiction. And Snicket's way of foreshadowing is to pretty much tell you what's going to happen.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the build-up is that, how does this come to be?
Yeah.
So they're two-parter, sorry. So how do you foreshadow in your novels, or do you think there's a formula for foreshadowing? And the non-fiction side of this question is, if you were to read the current scenario, what do you think it foreshadows?
Yeah, so I think foreshadowing is a great question, and so I think the person who does foreshadowing in a way that I love is Kigo Higashino, a Japanese crime fiction novelist, where what he does is that, like, he foreshadows who did it in a very obvious way, and so you are like very proud of yourself. Okay, like, I know who did it. Like, yeah, it's so clear. And then when it turns out why it was done
And how
it was done, it doesn't matter anymore who did it. Like, it's really a question of the why and the how, and suddenly like all of that becomes irrelevant. And the why and the how just knocks you off. Like, and at the end of it, like, you're a complete mess by the end of a Higashino novel. Like, you're psychologically just destroyed. So I think like that misdirection of foreshadowing, where you think that the novel is about X or Y, and you have figured it out, and at the very end, it turns out that yes, you had, but it wasn't about that. It was about something else. I think that for me is like really, really interesting, and that's also what I try and do in some of my work, fiction. So yeah, it's not about making it so difficult for the reader, but so they do guess like what's happening, but that's not what the point is. The point is something else, and that they should not have any idea about until you hit them with it, right? So I think that's my. But again, there are people in science fiction who do like your classic foreshadowing also very, very well. Seth Dickinson and all those, like Traitor Baru Competent. Prashant is somewhere here. He knows about that. That book has the most brilliant like foreshadowing through 500 pages. Like, it's just incredible. Sorry, second question was non-fiction.
Yeah, if you were to consider the current scenario as a foreshadowing, what does it foreshadow for the future? If you were to consider, from your experience as both a science fiction writer as well as your experience with jurisprudence.
I think it's very clear. It's not foreshadowing. It's. I think we are living in like an increasingly unstable and violent world where you have the normalization of recently of industrial scale violence. In a way that wasn't the case before, and all of that portends towards a much darker future than we thought perhaps a few years ago. And I think it's not foreshadowing; it's quite in your face. So yeah. It's hard. It's hard, when you look at the genocide, in Palestine, to say, okay, we'll be fine. So yeah.
Shrabonti, may I request you to ask Gautam a question so we might not end on such
a
a
dark
bleak
note? Yeah.
note? Thank you.
No, I think we ended it on the right note. And
No, but the novel is not pessimistic. Like the novel is not.
Yeah,
So
the novel
so one
is-
one interesting thing, and maybe we can end on this is. So I feel like there is this fascination people have with dystopias, right? And strangely enough, in previous literary festivals and in various places, both my previous novels and this one have been called dystopias, which to me is very strange, because none of them are dystopias. And this one specifically, right? This one actually has a successful commune, right? That actually has, to an extent, managed to have an equal society. So I think the really helpful category is Ursula Le Guin's ambiguous utopia, where you have the instantiation of a utopia of a certain kind. But then again, it's never that easy, right? So utopias are hard earned, and there'll always be conflict within them. So what you're showing to readers is that there is, you can try and craft utopia even in this world, and then be prepared to, bear the burden of that. So I think like that would be a good way to describe the novel, and a more positive note on which to, to conclude. Yeah.
And actually, when I reviewed the novel, also I thought of that it wasn't so this whole binary between like utopia, dystopia, thankfully seems to be on the wane. So
I
now
mean, you still have very popular dystopias being
Of
written,
course.
because I think there's something about dystopias that really attracts
Yeah,
us.
that
But there is a lot more complex work that
Correct.
cannot be, classified so easily into utopia or dystopia. Yeah.
Okay,
So
thanks.
just one thing, and this is largely because I've read it in all your books, and in this book actually it's become a little bit more, I would say, refined. Your use of Deus ex machinas.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a very popular thing that's
Yeah,
there, and I think
yeah.
it's refined really well here. With Wall and Horizon. So I just want you to like talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, so I think perhaps the reason why Deus Ex Machina works better in this novel is because of what I said previously, where what it's leading up to is not what you think, actually, or is not. I mean, what the Deus Ex Machina leads up to is not the real point of the novel, right? So in that way, it's playing a role where it is taking the reader towards a conclusion that is not the real conclusion of the novel, and that's why perhaps it's sort of it's yeah.
Like any literature work that really inspires you, in terms of this tool.
Deus Ex Machina. I mean, it's basically like fantasy and science fiction has to use it, right? Because it's in the kind of world building you do. If it was fully logical, you won't get anywhere, right? Like the good guys will all like be dead by the end of the first chapter, and it's not going to happen, right? So you do need to have like your odd Deus Ex Machina. For those who don't know, Deus Ex Machina basically is a literary technique where it refers to Greek theater, where the god would like come up, from the stage, like the bottom of the stage, and they would pull. Yeah, would be in the machine, and it's basically used in literature as a device where, by a lucky coincidence, something totally like unforeseen, things turn out like fine, someone overhears a conversation just by chance, which tells them what to do, things like that, right? So yeah, that's Deus Ex Machina, and like I said, I think like genre needs Deus Ex Machina, just otherwise, in the real world, if you had those odds, you would never actually, yeah. It's you're a Russian novel basically, so yeah.
Okay, I think we'll kind of please feel free to continue the conversation with Gautam. Thank you. This has been such a nice, lovely, like
thank
a
you so
small,
much. Thank
intimate
you.
chat
Yeah.
with all of you being so engaged. And please,
Thank you so much.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
being here.
Yeah, once again, thanks to Gautam and Shravanti for this conversation.